The coffee was still warm when every screen in the deep space monitoring station went dead black. Dr. Sarah Chen's hand froze halfway to her mouth, the ceramic mug trembling as the familiar hum of 1,000 computers fell silent. Around her, the massive observatory that had watched the stars for 30 years plunged into an unnatural quiet. "What the hell?" muttered Jake Morrison, the night shift supervisor, his weathered face illuminated only by the emergency lighting that had kicked in. "Sarah, please tell me this is just another power surge." But Sarah wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the one screen that remained active, a small handheld tablet displaying readings from the Kepler Deep Field Array. The numbers didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible, over the distant hum of backup generators. "Look at Sector 77 Alpha." Jake stumbled over to her workstation, squinting at the tiny screen. "What am I looking at? Just looks like... Wait." His voice dropped to match hers. "That can't be right. The energy signature is off the charts." For 47 years, humanity had been searching for signs of intelligent life in the universe. They had built bigger telescopes, sent out more signals, and listened harder than any species in Earth's history. But they had always been looking for something like themselves: radio waves, structured signals, the gentle touch of civilization reaching across the void. They had never thought to look for something that could make stars disappear. "Sarah," Jake's voice cracked as he spoke. "Run the calculation again. Please tell me I'm reading this wrong." Sarah's fingers danced across the tablet, her years of training taking over even as her mind reeled. The data streamed past: wavelengths, energy outputs, gravitational distortions that shouldn't exist. "It's not a calculation error," she said finally. "Something just consumed the energy output of an entire star. In less than 6 hours." The two humans stood in the darkened observatory, staring at readings that suggested the impossible. Somewhere in the depths of space, 97 light-years away, a star that had burned for billions of years had simply stopped. But they didn't know the worst part yet. They didn't know it was moving toward Earth. And they certainly didn't know it had been asleep for a very, very long time. Chapter 2. The Pattern Emerges. 3 days later, the emergency session of the United Earth Defense Council was in chaos. "You're telling me," said General Patricia Voss, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, "that in 72 hours we've lost contact with 14 deep space monitoring stations, and now you're claiming it's all connected to some cosmic vacuum cleaner?" Dr. Chen stood at the front of the briefing room, her usually perfect appearance disheveled from 3 sleepless nights. Behind her, a holographic display showed the night sky as it had appeared 1 week ago, dotted with familiar constellations. With a gesture, she switched to the current view. Nearly 24 stars had simply vanished. "Not a vacuum cleaner, General," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was reporting. "Something that feeds on stellar energy, and it's not random. Look at the pattern." She highlighted the missing stars in sequence. They formed a rough line through space, each one approximately 6 light-years from the next. The line pointed directly toward the inner rim of the galaxy, toward Earth. "How fast is it moving?" asked Dr. James Reeve, the chief xenobiologist who had spent his career hoping for first contact. This wasn't the first contact he had imagined. "Based on the consumption pattern and the time intervals, we estimate it's traveling at roughly 10% of light speed," Sarah replied. Which means it'll be here in roughly 800 years, finished Admiral Chen Wu, the head of Earth's pathetic excuse for a space fleet. "Plenty of time to evacuate the solar system, assuming we can figure out where to go." But Sarah was shaking her head. "You're not understanding. This isn't just about the speed it's traveling. Each star it consumes is larger than the last. It's growing stronger, feeding on larger and larger energy sources." She brought up another display showing energy consumption rates. The curve was exponential. "At its current rate of growth," she continued, "by the time it reaches our solar system, it won't just consume our sun. It'll be capable of draining entire star clusters. And there's something else." The room fell silent. Everyone could see the fear in her eyes. "The gravitational readings suggest This thing isn't just big, it's artificially constructed. Someone, or something, built this. And 3 hours ago we detected something that looks like a signal coming from its core. General Voss leaned forward. What kind of signal? The kind that suggests it knows we're here. Chapter 3. The message. The signal arrived at Earth, exactly 17 minutes after Sarah's briefing ended. It wasn't like the radio transmissions humans had been sending into space for decades. It didn't travel at the speed of light, carried by electromagnetic waves. It simply appeared simultaneously in the mind of every human being on Earth. Finally, the word resonated not in their ears, but in their thoughts, accompanied by a sensation of vast, ancient irritation. 7 billion people stopped what they were doing and looked up at the sky. Finally, something interesting enough to wake me up. Dr. Sarah Chen was in her car, driving home from the emergency council meeting, when the voice filled her mind. She pulled over, hands shaking as the message continued. I have been sleeping for how long? Your mathematics are crude, but I estimate roughly 14 billion of your years. Do you know what woke me up? Around the world, people stumbled, cried, out fell to their knees, not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but from the sheer overwhelming presence of the consciousness touching their minds. It was like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. Your radio signals, your pathetic little electromagnetic. Squeaks finally reached me. After eons of silence, something new, something amusing. Sarah fumbled for her phone, trying to call the emergency council, but found her hands wouldn't obey her. None of her muscles would respond while the entity spoke. I am what your species would call a stellar engineer. I build stars, move stars, consume stars. I have watched galaxies be born and die, and I have been so very bored. The presence. In their minds shifted, and suddenly every human on Earth could see what the entity saw. They saw space from its perspective, vast, cold, and filled with the slow dance of celestial bodies. They saw the trail of consumed stars stretching behind it like breadcrumbs, each one a deliberate choice. But now, little builders of radio waves, you have given me a gift, purpose, entertainment. Do you know what I plan to do? The mental voice paused, and in that pause, Sarah Chen somehow found the courage to speak aloud, even though she knew it wouldn't matter. What do you want? She whispered. The entity heard her. Across the vast emptiness of space, it heard one small human's whispered question, and its amusement was like the warmth of a star. I want to see what you're made of. Chapter 4. The test. The presence withdrew from their minds as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving 7 billion humans gasping and confused. But the message wasn't over. Within hours, every piece of technology on Earth had received the same transmission. Not through radio waves or internet connections, but directly into their memory banks, as if the entity could simply reach across space and touch whatever it chose. The message was simple. Coordinates in space, a distance of exactly 100 light-years from Earth, and a single word, here. It's a test, said Dr. Reeve during the emergency session that night. The xenobiologist looked haggard, like he'd aged a decade in a single day. Think about it. An entity that can consume stars that's existed for billions of years suddenly takes interest in us. Why? General Voss paced behind the conference table. Because we're a threat? No, Sarah interjected, studying the readings from their long-range sensors. Because we're interesting. Look at the pattern again. Every star it consumed was empty. No planets, no life, nothing but burning hydrogen. It's been wandering through dead space for eons. Admiral Wu looked up from his tactical displays. So you're saying this thing is lonely? I'm saying it's bored, Sarah replied. And now it's found something new, something that builds things, that reaches out across space, that asks questions. It wants to see what we can do. The coordinates led to an empty patch of space that had never held anything of interest to human astronomers. But as their deep space telescopes focused on the location, they found something impossible waiting for them. A structure, massive, geometric, clearly artificial. It hadn't been there a week ago. "How big is that thing?" asked General Voss. Sarah ran the calculations twice before she trusted her answer. "Roughly the size of Earth's moon, and it's been constructed in less than 6 days." Constructed out of what? According to the spectral analysis, it's made from the matter of 3 destroyed solar systems, compressed, reformed, and shaped into something that our best physicists say shouldn't be able to exist. The structure was beautiful in its impossibility, a crystalline lattice that seemed to fold space around itself, creating geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. And it was clearly waiting for something. "A test," Dr. Reeve repeated. "But what kind of test?" The answer came the next day, when every human on Earth received the same dream. They dreamed of standing in a vast chamber made of crystallized starlight, facing a presence that was both ancient and curious. The presence spoke without words, showing them images of other species it had encountered over the eons. Some had been builders like humans. They had created cities, technology, art. When tested, they had failed to interest the entity, and their stars had been consumed to fuel its journey. Others had been warriors. They had fought bravely, throwing everything they had against the entity's power. They too had failed the test, and their civilizations had become fuel. But a few, a very few, had surprised the entity. They had shown it something new, something unexpected. These species had been spared, elevated, transformed into something greater than they had been before. "What's the test?" Sarah whispered in her dream, and the entity showed her. The crystalline structure it had built was a puzzle, a test of understanding, creativity, and determination. Inside its impossible geometry were the tools needed to communicate across the vast distances of space instantaneously. Technology that could reshape matter at the atomic level. Knowledge that could transform humanity into something capable of existing alongside entities that treated stars like candles. But there was a catch. The test had to be completed within one human lifetime. If humanity failed, if they couldn't solve the puzzle, couldn't prove they were worth preserving, the entity would continue its journey, and their sun would become just another source of fuel. "How do we even get there?" General Voss asked when the dream ended and the emergency council reconvened. 100 light years? Our fastest ships would take thousands of years. But Sarah was already working on the answer. The entity hadn't just shown them the test, it had given them the first clue. Hidden in the radio signals they had been broadcasting into space for decades, woven into the very transmissions that had woken the entity, was a pattern. A mathematical sequence that described how to fold space itself, how to step across the vast distances between stars as easily as walking through a door. "It's been waiting for us to figure this out on our own," she realized. The entity didn't wake up because of our signals. It woke up because we were finally close to understanding how to reach it. The test wasn't just about solving the puzzle waiting in that distant structure. The test was getting there in the first place, and humanity had less than 70 years to figure out how to walk between the stars. Epilogue. The First Step Doctor. Sarah Chen stood in the newly constructed deep space laboratory, watching the final preparations for humanity's first attempt at faster-than-light travel. It had taken them 12 years to build the ship, another 8 to understand the mathematics the entity had woven into their own transmissions. Around her, the brightest minds of the human species worked frantically on calculations that would have been considered impossible just 2 decades ago. They were preparing to take a step that would either elevate humanity to unimaginable heights or doom them to extinction. "Are you ready, Dr. Chen?" asked Captain Maria Santos, the test pilot who had volunteered to take the first ship through what they had learned to call a fold-in space. Sarah looked at the readings one more time. The ship was small, barely large enough for a single person, but it incorporated technology that seemed to blend human engineering with principles that came from somewhere far beyond their understanding. "The entity is still out there," she said, watching the displays that showed the continuing consumption of distant stars. Still moving toward us, still waiting, and still testing other species, added Dr. Reeve, who had spent the last 20 years studying the messages hidden in cosmic background radiation. We're not the only ones it's watching. That was the revelation that had changed everything. Humanity wasn't alone in facing this test. Across the galaxy, dozens of species were being presented with similar challenges. Most were failing, but some were succeeding. And those species were no longer limited to single planets, single star systems, or single galaxies. They had become something more, something that could exist on the same scale as entities that casually consumed stars. "The question," said Captain Santos, settling into the pilot seat of the experimental ship, "is whether we're clever enough to join them." Sarah smiled, despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Well, we're about to find out." The ship's engines hummed to life, and space itself began to bend around the small craft. For a moment, Sarah could see what the entity saw: the vast web of connections that linked every point in the universe, the hidden pathways that allowed consciousness to step between stars as easily as thoughts moved through a mind. Then the ship was gone, carrying humanity's first ambassador toward a test that would determine the future of their entire species. In the depths of space, something ancient and vast felt the ripple of their achievement and smiled with the warmth of 1,000 suns. Finally, it thought, something truly interesting. The test was just beginning.